record the next section of the lecture to post on the website, because now this gets into the Greek portion that we are preparing you for. And so let's go ahead and share the screen again and get to this next portion of our vocabulary lesson, where we're learning so much about the vocabulary that the Greeks taught us. Why? Because the Greeks studied forms of government. They literally made a study of it. Now, here's the deal. We learned so much from this one period of Athens. It's so enlightening. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time reviewing a little bit of what we said, but with a different focus. Now, you know that they had social unrest going on in Athens like you do. Raise your hand if you believe we have social unrest in this country. Is everybody happy? No. You saw that on January 6th. You saw it through the summer, through the Black Lives Matter protest. You see that people aren't content. Athens was going through the same thing. The first solution was to get tough on the protesters, all right? Law and order. And Draco comes in with his draconian rules. It just made things worse, right? So instead, they got a new tyrant, right? New leader from the aristocratic class, Solon, who said, let's get to the root of the problem. The root of the problem is debt and poverty and enslavement and all that. And so he passed all these laws to get rid of, to attack the problem as its source. And it worked. And his successor, Pisistratus, was successful in helping to get the economy going with these new forces of meritocracy, people growing more olives than ever before. It just unleashed all sorts of economic potential. But then you have the problems of hereditary tyrants. This may be a good one. This was a really good one. The one before, not so good. This one was horrible, as we talked about, Hippias. So the aristocratic elite had no choice but to have a coup d'etat against Hippias, throw him out, send him packing, and Cleisthenes takes over. Isagoras, though, has a coup of his own. In this case, though, he got a foreign military to come help him overthrow the government. Now, he thought as long as he had that military there, he was safe and nobody could kick him out, right? Of course, you know what happens next. It's the revolution of 508 BCE. What about today? There's a difference between coups and revolutions. Where I'm taking you right now is to Myanmar, where 3 weeks ago, the military, once again, because this has happened many times in their history, has overthrown the democratically elected government of Myanmar and their leader, Aung San Suu Kyi. You'll see her in this clip. And put themselves in as an oligarchy. Let's kind of go through some of these terms first before we go any further. Tyranny, single ruler, tyrant with absolute power. Aristocracy, ruled by the nobility, right? The people, the landowning class in those ancient times. Plutocracy, ruled by the rich. Oligarchy, elitism, ruled by a few. In this case, we're talking about a military oligarchy, a junta or a junta. You hear that's describing an oligarchy. A few generals that take over the country for their own benefit. And you know what these people are? They're just a bunch of drug warlords. That's really what they are. They've made so much money on the drug trade. Now, they had to give up their power for a short time. There was a democracy, fledgling, demos, ruled by the people. But then they decided it wasn't working for them. So guess what? They decided to take the country over again. So a military coup 3 weeks ago. How are the people going to respond?
Tens of thousands of demonstrators filled the streets in Myanmar to protest former civilian leader Aung San Suu Kyi's trial, which began this week in secret. Protesters have been calling for the reinstatement of democracy since the...
Now let's stop right there. So they're holding this trial in secret. They've arrested the duly elected leader of the country, and they're going to try this person for treason in secret. Now you know why in America we have, first of all, you do the grand jury. Yes, that's in secret because they haven't determined whether you've done anything wrong or not. But when they indict, then it's public so that bad things can't happen to the accused person. So everybody's worried about Aung San Suu Kyi right now. As well they should. A secret court run by these military generals?
The military launched a coup on February 1st. And as Nick Schifrin reports, the protesters in Myanmar are also demanding a society that ignores their new military rulers.
At secret locations across Myanmar, healthcare workers who used to work for the government now say they work for the people.
This will be a great trouble for the military control this kind of civil disobedience movement. It's the kind of protesting not obey the 10 orders prescribed by the military.
This doctor asked us to withhold his name for security reasons. He's on strike from a government hospital and instead treating anti-coup protesters. And he says the doctor's strike is only the beginning.
If the health systems fail and shut down, they might get a lot of problems. We started the movement and asked every ministry and other departments to join us to make a bigger, stronger society movement.
Hundreds of thousands of public servants are on strike as part of the Civil Disobedience Movement, or CDM. They defy military limits on gatherings to launch the country's largest protests in more than 10 years. Firefighters created their own fire brigades. Engineers stopped constructing buildings. When the real police arrived to arrest the doctors, citizen police rushed into the street to protect them, and teachers refused to teach in government schools.
Teachers, lawyers, as well as doctors, they're people we learn from, people who guide us in life.
Amin Thant is a Burmese journalist who was part of a Reuters team that won a Pulitzer Prize for stories critical of the Burmese military that landed 2 of its reporters in prison. She says the civil disobedience movement is targeting the states and military's foundations. Protesters heard the military might seize money from banks, so they blocked the central bank and called on bank staff to join the movement. Protests also try to prevent the junta from collecting taxes.
Things that really directly impact the any government's ability to govern and enact their policy and fund what they're doing.
What the military is doing is reversing Myanmar's fragile democracy. The February 1st coup declared a state of emergency and installed army leader Min Aung Hlaing for at least a year. Democratic leader Aung San Suu Kyi is now in house arrest and facing charges that could lead to years of imprisonment. And now the junta is beginning to use violence. In southern Myanmar, police fired rubber bullets. In the north, soldiers fired to disperse the crowd. And this week, for the first time since protests began, soldiers appeared on the streets in armored vehicles. The military spokesman claims civil servants are being manipulated.
So here's a government spokesman saying, oh, everybody's out there is acting irrationally and we need to arrest everybody and just keep these military generals in power. So the question for us right now is to keep an eye on Myanmar, keep an eye on this, because how rare is it? Even today, how rare is it that you have a revolution like 508? Never happened in the ancient world, but even coups today, those people that take over often stay in power. Let me give you another example. This is Belarus. Belarus had an election last fall, about the time we were having our election, about a month before. And the leader here, Lyshenko, lost, but he controls the military and he just took the country away. It's one of the last kind of Stalinist kind of governments left on the earth. And he just, cracked down. I'm not leaving power any. I don't care what the vote says, right? And he just made up numbers. Okay, the people had elected this lady here, who's now in hiding, by the way, in England for her life. But these massive protests went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And yet this guy is still in power. Usurping power, taking it away from the duly elected leaders. So mostly coups are successful. Napoleon, for example, in France, which was kind of an important one. You also see, I hope you learn from this lesson. Now, pay attention to me right now, why the United States believes in having a civilian leader over the military, while a civilian president and a civilian Department of Defense secretary are civilians. So our military cannot get involved like this. It was a real concern for Jefferson, so much so that he realigned the entire instructional program for our military at West Point so that they studied more than just warfare, and that they wouldn't come out of their barracks under some colonel or leader, like in Egypt, for example, or let's talk about Pakistan, Myanmar several times. So these things can't happen here. And you notice our military, they stayed out of this election completely. And that's what we expect. So we don't have this problem. And they addressed this back in the very earliest days of our republic, especially President Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States. So this idea that a powerful group of people can take over and then it's really hard to dislodge them, that's a real issue. So that's what's different. A revolution in Myanmar would be that nobody pays any attention to the government. the junta, the oligarchy, disintegrates, and they can dismantle that military and make it over again. Every country needs a military of some sort, but remake it so it serves the people instead of subjugates the people. That will be a revolution there. They've got to, I don't know how they can do this. How can they win against that military that will do anything to stay in power? So we'll see. But if they do like the Americans did at the beginning of the American Revolution and just quit paying attention and doing their own government on the sides and running themselves, maybe it can happen. So this moment was radical change, where all revolutions are, and this one in Greece teaches us some big lessons. Now, we got these definitions here. One of the virtues of democracy is it unleashes a meritocracy, that average everyday people can rise up and be leaders and can do great things, right? Whereas it was based on your family and who you knew, whether you could ever be a leader in a country or not. Now, the Greeks, of course, had a lot of comparables. In other words, what they did was they studied all the little city-states in Greece and looked at all the different forms of government and how they did things differently. They analyzed politics just like we analyze, all of the biology and zoology and those kinds of things. They broke it down into different styles, different types. So that's why we get all these definitions. But the biggest comparable to Athens, and it's now democracy that was created by Cleisthenes with a simple vote, the big comparable was this huge empire that had just been born to their east. Now, you can't get a more contrast than this: an autocracy and a democracy. An autocracy is an all-powerful ruler, right? It goes well beyond monarchy, which means mono, rule by one. Let's talk about it. Cyrus the Great was the person that created the first world's great empire. And he started out as a monarch in Persia. And it was a fairly small place, but, sizable enough that he had a pretty good military. And he merges, basically takes over, a kingdom next door called Media. And together, they were able to launch their military and attack out of this region right here and conquer all the way to the steppes of China, all the way to the gates of Europe, and the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia to boot. Now, the virtues of empire or legion, basically trade that was non-existent now could happen in the empire. Information, communication, people working together in different regions for mutual benefit. When he conquered you, there were basically just a few rules. Number one, don't rebel. Number two, in times of war, put forth your share of the military load. So if your little country, has archers, send your archers. If you have infantry, send your infantry. If you have cavalry, send your cavalry. And so we'll all go into this together. And then pay your taxes. By the way, their taxes were probably lower than some of the people they overthrew, like the Assyrians. The reason the Persians were so popular is they overthrew a group of us called the Assyrians, who were the most evil, terrible, very bad place. Only Sparta was as bad as these Assyrians were. And when he overthrew them, people go, hey, we like these guys. Plus, there's peace. You can travel and share goods and services and things. Oh, and by the way, he did some enlightened things, really modern, frankly. He allowed freedom of religion. He said, I'm not going to come in and try to change your culture and make you all, speak my language and also learn my religion. Be nice, it would be cool if you did, but if you don't, that's fine. He liberated, for example, the Jews in Babylonia, let them go back and rebuild their temple in Judea. So he's a hero in the Bible, in the Old Testament. But then what happens is he starts to merge into an area that had been now settled by Greeks. And you know how independent-minded the Greeks are. And the way he was able to rule this vast empire, because he knew monarchy wasn't going to work anymore, he appointed governors to provinces throughout the entire empire. He broke it into, like federalism, like Canada has provinces. The United States, we call them states, right? So there would be like a satrap of a governor, if you will, Cox over the Utah one. Say Utah would be right in here somewhere. That's kind of how we divided it up. Now, they were loyal specifically to him, and then he gave orders and whatever, and they gave reports back, and he created an autocracy. In modern times, autocracies are a little easier to maintain than they were in ancient times. So you got to give them a lot of credit. Their communication systems and everything else that they did under Persian rule was amazing. And their education level was way high. Their standard of living was way high. Much better than the Greeks, by the way. But you look at like the Soviet Union, they became an empire, vast one. Some almost 20 countries were subjugated by the Soviet Union. More than that if you count Eastern Europe. In modern times, it was autocracy. Stalin was an autocratic leader. And because of modern communication systems and modern controls, they turned it to even a harsher version of autocracy called totalitarianism. Now, here's the thing I want to say about autocrats and totalitarian leaders. You can get good ones and you can get bad ones. Cyrus was a good one. His son was a good one, okay? This freedom of religion. Cambyses, the second, continues the conquest and conquers Egypt, which gives them vast amounts of wealth. There was nowhere richer than Egypt, and now they controlled it, Persian Empire. And again, they allowed the Egyptians to practice their religion and whatever, and yet they provided navy support to whatever they were doing in the Mediterranean. Darius the First also expanded, but then he had some rebellions. And the most famous one was right here at a little place called Sardis in Ionia. Ionia was a Greek state that got taken over by the Persians along this coast of present-day Turkey. The Greeks, of course, you know, had expanded all throughout the Mediterranean and whatever, and they had these little colonies, if you will. Now, Ionia, being Greek, they said, we're going to overthrow these Persians. They just didn't do the math. They didn't realize how big and powerful this superpower was. And they marched their troops to the local city that was running the satrapy, basically the province, and they burned it to the ground. They also asked for help from other Greek states, and Athens sent some ships to help and some supplies. For the Persians, this was an act of terrorism. So terrorism, it depends on which side you're on, right? For the Persians, this was an act of terrorism. For the Greeks, it was an act of independence and freedom, if you will. We have a difference of opinion here. Darius the First pulled his military together, marched on Ionia, and destroyed it stone by stone, literally. It didn't exist after they were done. He had to set the example for the rest of the empire. If you rebel, it isn't going to work out well for you. That's the power of autocracy. But by the same token, he also said, anybody that aided and abetted the Ionians, oh yeah, we're looking at you, Athens. We're coming for you. And they did. In one of the most epic stories in all of Western history. Basically, the Persians decided to knock out Greece, knock out Athens, the biggest city, most powerful one there. And look, on paper, the Athenians didn't stand a chance. But the first fleet that was gathered from all along the Phoenicians and gathered up from the Egyptians and all along this coastline, even some Greek ships, came up here and were going to circle around to Athens and destroy it, burn it to the ground, just as payback for losing their capital city too. And a big storm came up, a Texas-style storm, and sunk the fleet. Whew. The first attack was hurt by the weather. The second attack now, they just rebuilt. They were so wealthy, they just rebuilt and sent even a bigger force. And they then started this invasion of 490. So 492, the fleet was destroyed. 2 years later, they're back. At this particular point, Athens realized it doesn't have the strength. I mean, they're outnumbered for a start, just with this group coming over, this first group, 3-1. And they have a bigger navy and it's not looking good. So the Athenians panic and they send one of their messengers, a runner by the name of Phidippides, who ran 140 miles to Sparta. That same Sparta, the ones that tried to help Pythagoras overthrow, that one. Well, the Spartans were asked for help. So we can't defeat these alone. We need your help. You're the best military. Let's get you on the field against these guys. Sparta didn't buy the argument. They're coming after you, not us. And they said no, that Athens must go it alone. Phidippides returns with the bad news. So here is the Hoplite Army, it's called. It's a citizen army of between 8,000 to 10,000 Athenians who met the forces landing at a beach area called Marathon. Marathon is a beach area with hills on each side. One of the advantages the Persians have in war is cavalry. Cavalry that would run around behind you, disrupt your lines, and then you could destroy them easily. They couldn't use the cavalry because they had parked themselves between two hills. The Athenians were very thinly guarded though. Normally a phalanx, a hoplite army, wants to be shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield, and with spears, and about 3 deep at this point in history. They're less than 2 deep, and they're not shoulder to shoulder, guarding this pass. The Persians are landing their troops. For weeks go by. The only thing they've done is yell taunts at each other. But the Athenians realize they have to try something desperate. So here's what happens next. The Athenians attack, but they break their force into 3 groups. The 2 strongest phalanxes were put on the side, the weaker portion put in the middle. They then attacked in a frontal assault, just straight like this, down until they met the Persians. The Persians were more than ready. They started pushing back, and this center group looked like they were going to lose. They started to retreat. They started to back up. And what they were doing was sucking the Persians into a trap, literally. The Persians thinking, we beat them, they're running, they chased after them. And when they did, the 2 sides with the strongest warriors crushed them as if in a box. And when you're this many troops and you're crushed in a box, you can't move side to side. You can't fight laterally. It was a massive slaughter. 20 or so thousand Persians would die. So some of them tried to get to their boats. They jumped into the water, and the Greeks caught up with them. And literally there's story after story of them reaching up to get onto the boat, and their arm gets cut off by a Greek who's in the water with them. This was one of the great defeats of all time of a superpower by a much smaller power. And of course, you know the next of the story. Phidippides, that same runner who had run to Sparta and back 140 miles, sprints the 20K or 26.2 miles to Athens, where he yells Nike, which means victory, and dies on the spot of dehydration, no doubt, and lack of electrolytes. And here, this course story gives birth to the modern Olympic race, the marathon in the Olympics. Now, listen, guys, I got to be honest with you. The Olympics is a pretty cool thing, right? And last year, our Olympics got canceled. The Olympics were scheduled for Tokyo, and they got canceled. This Greek invention, which was really awesome, because the Greeks for 800 years would stop wars in order to hold the Olympics. I wish we could do that. The last Olympics got canceled because of the virus, right? They had to shut Japan down, and they weren't about to let it, lots of tourists come in and watch the Olympics. This year, it looks like it's going to happen. It may be athletes only, but the Olympics, I think, is a special gift that we were given by the Greeks. And so as we look at this, you guys might see this when I hit the stop share and I throw this on the screen. The Olympics is kind of my cause, okay? It's kind of my thing. And I'm on the technical advisory board for Soldier Hollow, where we train our biathletes and also our cross-country skiers, and also the Nordic combined, where they do the big ski jumps, and then they after they get their score there, they come over to Soldier Hollow and they ski, and that's a combined score. So all these Olympic events, and I help there because it's so cool. It's so cool to watch young kids up there participate. We got kids that are 5th and 6th grade that are training in all these sports. You guys can do that too. We have one of the greatest venues of winter sport, of Olympic sports anywhere in the world, thanks to our hosting the Olympics in 2002, which we'll talk more about next time. But here's the deal, right? In the summer sport, for me, the only sport that matters is triathlon. And this picture here was taken when I was in Luzon for the 30th anniversary of triathlon being an Olympic sport. And we got to watch all of the Olympic hopefuls compete and race, and we got to race on their same course. And the reason we do this is because we basically are a fundraising arm. We raise money for our Olympic team so our Olympic team can be success. And in the United States, actually, the last Olympics in Rio, we got our first gold medal in triathlon, which is really exciting, Gwen Jorgensen. So we'll talk more about the Olympics. This is where we'll pick it up for next time. But let's go ahead and stop recording now.